they call it. And he quoted the song that he has on his arm, and it says, "There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain that goes on and on. Empty chairs at empty tables. Now my friends are dead and gone. Oh, my friends, don't ask me what your sacrifice was for. Empty chairs at empty tables, where my friends will sing no more." And that got me, because you can feel the loss that Chris and the rest of these had. Every waking moment is agony for them. And so, the shooter said we couldn't measure it. We can measure it. Complete compensation. Anything less than complete is incomplete and it's unjust. So Dr. Bradley testifies at $600 an hour. That equates to $10 a minute. Each of us live our lives minute by minute. The shooting was 30 minutes, but we measure our time second by second and minute by minute. Time is all we're given. And so if we take just a fourth of that and multiply that times the years lost, that is $1.2 billion. When you average that out over these plaintiffs, that's $25 million for every blank that you fill out. If you feel like that number should be less, then put the number in. If you feel like it should be $23 million per blank, because there were 23 victims in this case, put 23 million. But understand that we had to put each of these witnesses up there so that you could see and hear and feel what it is that they have gone through and would continue to go through. So, thank you, Judge. So each one of these parents out here that lost a child is being asked this question. What amount of money will fairly and reasonably compensate them for losing their child? The worst pain imaginable. And so for each one of these blanks, $25 million for each one of them. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And that's why the first thing we told you when we were picking this jury was the judge is going to tell you, do not let bias, sympathy, or prejudice play any role in your deliberations. And so when you measure how much harms and losses they have, and the numbers add up to a lot, don't have any sympathy over there when you're filling those numbers out. Don't have any mercy, like Demetrius said he was going to have no mercy on the unsuspecting, innocent victims that he took out that day. No mercy. And so for each of these, it's easy. 25 million. If you think that that's too much, then put a figure in there that's less. If you think it's not enough, put a figure in there that's more. Each one. Now this one is the injuries. Same deal. This is Flo Rice. And Flo is back there. And you will notice some of these plaintiffs didn't come every day because it was too emotionally draining for them to hear this day after day after day. But I'm glad they're here today. They've been a tremendous support system for me. 25 million each blank. And that goes for Flo Rice, that goes for Trenton Beasley, that goes for Chase Yarborough, that goes for Clayton Horn, that goes for each one of them. Now, one of the questions the judge told you is, do you find, is going to be number 22, do you find by clear and convincing evidence that the harm listed to each one of these was the result of malice? Yes. Look at his own writing. This fact of Natasha, let me talk with you about Natasha. The game Wolfenstein, that was the character in Wolfenstein. The MK Ultra, you're going to see cell phone searches for what is MK Ultra, followed by a whole bunch of playing of Rainbow Six, the video game where the CIA is in it. Not one mention when you get back there, not one, of Natasha or the CIA, which he supposedly met in 8th grade. He wrote a whole lot of stuff without saying Natasha or the CIA. What sum of money should be assessed against Dimitrios Pogorchis as exemplary damages? We're going to let you decide this one. Decide how much of a punishment. This is the accountability that Dimitrios Pogorchis is going to get. This right here. What will it take so that the Prime Minister of Pakistan and the President of Pakistan, a country of 200 million people, 8,500 miles away, will hear what it is when they send their foreign exchange student over here and she comes back and they have to meet her at the airport? Your verdict needs to be heard. So the answer to these questions are yes. You determine how much. We heard with just a little whisper, they would come running. Well, we don't need a whisper. We need a shout. Shout so that all across everywhere will know. Get mental help. Know what's going on in your home. Safely store your weapons. We can't send our kids to school and bring them home in body bags. The first line of defense is parents. We want to solve this problem. It starts right at home. You're responsible for your kids. If you're going to bring them into the world, be responsible for them. If you're going to bring weapons into your home, be responsible for them. If we don't do something, nothing is going to happen. And so we roll through, and I've got 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to go through and just remind you of the tremendous honor, and why me, I don't know. But the honor that I have to speak on these people's behalf. It is the best thing in my life. He's a hero. He knew by grabbing that door when Dimitrios was grabbing it, he told the others to run, and Dimitrios shot him through the door while he was letting other people run. If a hero isn't worth $150 million, I don't know what is. And then that's followed up by another one, Christian Riley Garcia. When you love your kids and you treat them right and you monitor them and you provide a great environment for them, this is what you get. You get the Christian Riley Garcias of the world. And Aaron Kyle McLeod, you heard from Gail McLeod about what a fine, upstanding young man this was. He got hit in the arm and bled out for 5 minutes while he was text messaging his sister, who has to live with that for the rest of her life. She got to tell him she loved him, and he told her he loved her back, but no young sister should have to do that one hallway away from her brother at the high school. Jared Connor Black, the protector. This was Pam's son. The protector. He had Asperger's, and he protected those that were less fortunate than him. What an inspiration. Flo Rice, one of my heroes. She got shot in both legs. She watched as her fellow substitute teacher, died. She heard every dripping glass and thought that it was the shooter coming back, shooting again. She was being hunted. And what did she do? She survived. But not without these scars that leave her. And you know what? She's got such a great support system and a great daughter, but she is a true inspiration. And Clayton Horn, what can you say about this kid? The shooter shot him and then stood over him to finish him off. And fortunately, he kicked up at the last minute and it went through his arm and he survived. And he told his mom and dad, who'd been out there every day, I'm going to get back to doing what everything I did beforehand. He got on a bull. He did pole vaulting. He has moved on, but he carries this around. And you saw him. I was so proud of him because he's so positive. He is one of the few that just isn't emotionally devastated by this. But you know what tore him up? Was when he said he met Chris Stone in first grade. And he said, that kid would give you the shirt off his back. He said, that kid was the best kid that I've ever met. Best person I've ever met to this day. And when you hear and you saw his dad get up and take the stand, you know why that is. So I'm going to sit down now, and I'm going to let these other lawyers get up and talk with you about their clients. And then I'll be back up to talk in a little while. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Good afternoon. I also want to thank you for your patience and your dedication in listening to all the evidence. Chase Yarborough's life was miraculously spared on May 18th, 2018. The doctors told him at the hospital that God kept him alive for big things. Chase believes this, and everyone who knows Chase believes it as well. Chase is a survivor. He is grateful. Every day since May 18th, Chase is physically and psychologically reminded of that preventable massacre. He faces every challenge with courage, grace, and faith. May 18th was the last day that Chase Yarborough woke up, carefree, stress-free teenager. Chase described himself as funny, as outgoing. He liked to joke around. He loved his friends and his family. He was planning on going to college, and he would have been, now is, the first generation to attend college. He was so proud. Chase is an only child, raised by loving, involved, nurturing parents. They knew when Chase was sad. They knew when he was happy. They knew when he was struggled. Chase didn't have to tell them, they knew. May 18th was also the last day that Chase woke up without lead projectiles embedded and resting in his body. On May 18th, 2018, Chase was shot in the kiln closet with his other friends. He didn't know he was shot, and he escaped, and he ran, and he got out of that building. He called his father and told his dad, there's a shooter. His dad said, run, run, and Chase ran until he couldn't run any longer. And his ankle gave way, and he crawled to a ditch because he thought the shooter was chasing him. Now, when he went to the hospital, he was told that he was in fact shot. He was shot in the head. He was shot in the back. He was shot in the arm. He had grazes, bullet grazes on his temple and on his other arm. The doctors told him the projectiles have to stay because it's going to be too dangerous and too risky to remove him, and they sent him home. Chase gets home. Not shortly thereafter, the hospital calls and tells them, bring Chase back immediately. They pack up and they go back to the hospital. Chase thought he was dying. When he got to the hospital, They rushed him in and they did additional testing. And they told him that he has a projectile, a lead projectile in his heart. The doctors didn't know how it got there. They said, how you're alive is a miracle. They believed that the wound on his neck, that a projectile went into his neck, and the heat from it then cauterized the artery after it went into the artery. The projectile traveled through his bloodstream and is in his heart, where it stays today. Every day, Chase is reminded of this shooting. He's got a bullet in his head that he feels every time he washes his hair. He sees the scars from the bullet wounds and he feels them. He feels the pain every day, every single day. Now, Dr. Peterson was talking about subjective and objective. Let's look at what objective is. Objective are those bullets in his heart and his head. Chase was diagnosed with PTSD. We understand why. Chase will never live a carefree life again. He will live with a shattered heart for the rest of his life.
I'm going to move fast because we're running a little bit short on time, but my name is Blake Yapfel, and I represent Trenton Beasley. And I'll echo what Mr. McGuire said, in that we need to send a message. And one of my favorite lines ever is, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit, if you think you're too small to send a message, try spending the night in Galveston outside without a mosquito net. The truth of the matter is, unless we've walked in those shoes of a parent whose child has been murdered, or in a survivor of a shooting like this, we can't know the depth and the magnitude of the grief they felt. So I won't tell you that I know the magnitude of that grief. What I will tell you is a little about Trent. Trent was a 15-year-old boy who loved baseball, who loved fishing, and who loved talking about baseball and fishing. And on May 18th, that all changed. On May 18th, he heard 3 shots. Out of fear and not knowing what that was, he rushed to the patio door that was locked with his classmates. He then turned to the kiln room and had to break it with his friend Hunter so that they could all get inside. Problem is, once it was broken, they were trapped in a room with an open door. Trent laid in that room with his friends, attempting to barricade that door with the kiln, as a shotgun barrel went off over and over in that room beside his head. He laid in that room with his friends as they were shot and as they were killed. He lay in that room, helpless, as he listened to Chris Stone take his last breath. And he laid in that room, preparing for those last breaths to be his. I believe that while we can't know that magnitude of that grief, we do know, based on the evidence in this case, that it's a burden of grief that will last for the rest of all of these people's lives. My prayer, and I think the best we can hope for, is that your decision and your verdict in this case will make that burden of that grief just a little easier to bear, knowing that the responsibility for the incident on May 18th, for the shooting on May 18th, has been delegated and assigned. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is James Miller. I'm the attorney for Farah Naz and Abdul Aziz, who are the parents of Sabika Sheikh, the 17-year-old Pakistani exchange student who was sent here to learn and who died in the closet of the art room at Santa Fe High School on May 18th. On their behalf, because they can't be here to thank you in person, I thank you for your service on this jury today. Sabika, when she died, was preparing for a lifetime of service herself. She wanted to grow up to be a diplomat, to build bridges between Pakistan, her home country, and other countries. That's why she came to America on a scholarship to study. She beat out 7,000 other students for a spot in that exchange program to spend 10 months studying at an American high school, living with an American family. That tells you something about how remarkable she was. How many other kids have the courage and the commitment at age 16 to pursue their dreams and study more than 8,000 miles from home in a country they have never visited, with a language and a culture so different from their own? Sabika had that courage and that drive. You heard her parents say how thrilled they were, how proud, yet at the same time how anxious about letting her go. Abdul, her father, spoke about the sacrifice that that family made as parents to let their oldest daughter pursue her dreams. They had no idea the depth of that sacrifice. In America, Sabika had a successful year. She made friends. She was an excellent student growing up, and she was an excellent student here in America. She spoke to her family almost every single day. But by May, she was ready to come home. She was just 19 days away from coming home. And both she and her parents were counting down the days. They were celebrating Ramadan. She would call them, even though the family was 10 hours away, to break the fast with them, to keep the faith with her family. She missed the food from home. You heard her dad say she liked biryani rice. She was looking forward to that. Farah and Abdul, like so many of the parents we heard from, described the confusion and the rising panic and the helplessness of May 18th when they learned there was a shooting at their child's school and they couldn't reach them. The helplessness that these parents felt was compounded by being a half a world away. And eventually, Mr. Aziz spoke to Sabika's homestay father and heard in broken English the words that have burned into his mind: Sabika is no more. When her body came back to Karachi 5 days later, a crowd of hundreds was waiting for her at the airport, and an honor guard from the Pakistani army. The president and the prime minister of that country visited Sabika's parents to pay their respect to this remarkable child. Sabika came to America full of hopes and dreams and ambitions, and she came home in a casket. She did not deserve to die like that. And on behalf of her parents, I am asking you to hold these defendants accountable for her death. I'll close with the words of her mother. She was my oldest child. She was my friend. She had a lot of dreams, and not a day passes I don't miss her.
Cynthia Tisdale, a vibrant, loving, caring, 63-year-old woman when her life was taken. Let me tell you about degrees that mattered. We heard about doctors with degrees. Let me talk about the degrees that mattered, especially to her. She was a wife. She was a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, a teacher, a friend. She didn't work out of necessity. She worked to provide these children a difference, to teach lessons about life and love. Her life was taken so short, robbing her family, this community, of love that she could give, lessons she could teach. Her husband, William, she was the caregiver for him. Upon her passing, he gave up his ghost to go join her. The last words that she ever wrote were the words that they shared in life, that they shared with their family. 3 words, the most powerful, enduring. I love you. It's what should have been said and spoken more often. Reese Tisdale, you saw him take the stand. He spoke on his behalf, on behalf of his family. They are all devastated. Instead of sharing relationships and talking with their mother about what's going on at their homes and on celebrations, they do it at the cemetery. Jennifer, Reese's wife, she taught in our schools. She had to give it up. The pain was so bad. Reese, he was there. He's forever haunted by what he saw and what he couldn't do. He's plagued by anguish, depression, grief, despair. His life was spent in service to us in our community, to serve and protect. On that day, he couldn't protect his mother. He couldn't protect those kids. As a result, he eventually gave up the force. He couldn't handle the pain anymore. He wanted to find a way to bring joy into people's lives. He wanted to find some still waters to walk behind or beside. He talked about how he was grown up and raised. His dad said, raise up a child in the way you want him to go. It's the way he did it. It's the way his kids turned out. It all starts at home. It started at their home. They had the responsibility, among other things, to protect the keys, to protect the guns. The book of Romans has a chapter about lessons. It says the lessons that were written to teach, to provide encouragement and hope for a better today and a brighter tomorrow. What are the lessons we've learned here? Do not let what was taught here be forgotten. Use the lessons of these lives, of these people, to make a difference, an impact, to provide teachings and encouragement for hope of a better today, a brighter tomorrow. On behalf of the Tisdale family, all of these families, help us make a difference. Help us protect our teachers, our students, our families, our friends, our children. Do not let them suffer the pain of the lessons that we, unfortunately, have now had to endure. By and with your verdict, stand united with us to make a difference. Be our voice. Be Cynthia Tisdale's voice. Help her teach one more lesson, a lesson of responsibility and accountability. Make your lesson be bold. Make it be strong. Let it be Santa Fe strong.
May 18, 2018 is Rhonda Hart's every day. She got up at 4:30 that morning to go to her bus route. The job her dad had, the job she liked. She liked being around kids. She's on her route, she's coming back, she finds out there's something's going on at the school. They say, come back, park in the back. She goes back and she's beginning to wonder, but she's following orders. She had been in the military. She starts asking people what's going on. There was a shooting. She started wondering about Kimberly. She texts her, no response. She really starts worrying then, asking others. And remember when she saw Isabella Lamance, the girl that had been on her bus, she called her her girl. She wrapped her arms around her, holding her, takes her to a bus, sits on the second seat. In just a minute, what does Isabella say? Miss Rhonda, we think Kimberly's dead. Rhonda didn't want to believe that. Why would you? And she waits hours. She goes to the unification building where all the parents are. And slowly by slowly, as parents find their child, they leave, and then a group of parents is left. They're sent to another building, 5:30, 6 o'clock. Can you imagine what that time must have been like? Knowing that a shooting has occurred, your child's not answering their phone, and you're sent to a room, someone comes walking in and says, what clothes did she wear? They tell her, she's dead. Even then, the shock, the pain, the misery, there's no way that this could be true, but it was true. She winds up going to the funeral home, and remember that Kimberly was covered up to here. For a year, Rhonda couldn't even function. Her father had to cook meals. She really wanted to be with Kimberly, but she had Tyler to take care of. She's been in therapy ever since at VA, but she's tried to make a difference also. You heard about the act that she got passed through the House of Representatives, sitting on some senator's desk, I guess, because that's what they do up there. They don't do anything, but you can do something, and you can be heard to Washington, D.C. It is distasteful for me to talk about money and life. You could fill this room full of money. Each one of these parents want their child back. But money is all that you can award. That's all. Nobody goes to jail. It's money. But your money will say something. It's not what it is, but what does it say? And it needs to be heard loudly. I'm going to sit down a minute, but there's some little administrative things I want to go over with you. You recall the court, and the court's charge said 10-2. That means that 10 of you, to reach a verdict on these issues, 10 can agree. Now, if it's a different 10, let's say 10 answer one way, and then you get to another question, and 2 that were in the 10 drop out, and then the 2 were out and will come back in, you can't do that. So if you want to be a part of this verdict from start to finish, this verdict needs to be 12-0. Every one of you. Also, credibility. The fact that someone has a bunch of degrees and has done research and is on this board and that board and this school, you can believe all that that witness says, nothing of what that witness says, or only part of what that witness says. It's entirely up to you. You also know that the burden of proof we have is preponderance of the evidence, the greater weight and degree of the credible evidence. One place that that can be applied and should be applied is where are these keys? Is it more likely than not that these keys were stored in the location exactly where Dimitri said they were? I will sit down here shortly. The defense will have an opportunity to respond to us, and then Clint and I will have an opportunity to respond to what they say. We look forward to responding to their argument.
gentlemen of the jury, we are going to take our lunch break now. You still have not heard all of the closing arguments. So, again, please do remember my instructions. So we are going to break for lunch, and we will resume closing arguments at 1:40. So we'll stand in recess until that time.
All rise for the jury. 10-minute.
30 minutes.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to take a moment to join in the plaintiff's sentiments about thanking the court for their hospitality for the last 3 weeks. They have done an excellent job of not only coordinating everything that was going on in the courtroom, but behind the scenes, making sure that everything was done that needed to be done, and have been really good sports in helping us with all of our needs. So we join in thanking them. And we also join in thanking you for your time and attentiveness during this trial. It's not gone unnoticed to me that even though this has been a 3-week-long jury trial, that y'all have been paying very close attention. I've seen note-taking, I've seen eye contact, I've watched attention to witnesses, and as someone who does jury trials, I have to tell you, I am grateful that you have listened and managed to keep the intensiveness that you've had for those 3 weeks. Because as you can imagine, this case has not only been hard for the plaintiffs, it's been hard for the defendants, it's been hard for the attorneys. And I think that was pretty evident by the emotional display we saw when the plaintiffs' attorneys were giving the first part of their closing argument. So thank you for all of that. Now, I kind of have some general thoughts to start with, which is we all want to believe that there's a consequence for your actions. It's kind of what we're taught from the time we're young. In fact, it's almost biblical. And we think that the wrongdoer is going to be caught, the sinner is going to be punished, that all of your actions have consequences, that you can't go get a gun, kill and shoot innocent people, and escape punishment. But unfortunately, life is not that black and white. In this case, Dimitri Pagarchis is mentally ill. He's not had a trial, and he's not been held accountable for his crimes. And we can definitely feel, I mean, it's palpable, right? The level of frustration that the plaintiffs are feeling and the plaintiffs' attorneys are feeling for them, the angst they feel for their clients. That's partly why we're here. The feeling that Dimitri may be escaping punishment, the feeling that we need to blame somebody for what happened. In fact, if I were in their shoes, I can't tell you I wouldn't feel the same way. But feelings are not facts. And I completely disagree with Mr. McGuire about what he told you regarding the language in the jury charge that says you shouldn't let your feelings or bias prejudice you. Mr. McGuire said, well, that means that shouldn't keep you from writing a really big number on that line. I don't think that's what it means at all. I think what it means is that you have to put aside your feelings and biases, your feelings of sadness and empathy that you're naturally going to feel for the plaintiffs, that I feel for the plaintiffs, that my clients feel for the plaintiffs, that we all feel for the plaintiffs. Nobody's blaming plaintiffs in this case. Nobody wins in this case. Everyone has lost in this case. This case was lost before we ever walked through those doors. Now, putting aside your feelings and bias means that you try to look at the facts without the filter of the feelings, putting your sympathy and empathy to the side to just evaluate what's happened. And I know that sounds simple, right? But believe me, it's not quite so simple as we've seen here. Lawyers who are in trial all the time, this is their job, right? They get up here in front of juries and they talk to juries. That's what they do for a living. Yet they can't put their own feelings aside because this is a tragedy. And now we're asking you to do the same thing. And I realize it's a hard thing, but to evaluate the facts effectively, you have to put the feelings aside. And we hope that you'll be able to do that. Now, we all have great sympathy and empathy for what the plaintiffs have been through, but this is a search for the truth, which is what the whole trial is supposed to be about, right? You heard Mr. McGuire say that in his opening argument. It's supposed to be about your unfeeling analysis. It's supposed to be exactly what you're required to do to evaluate the facts of this case alone, so that justice is done in this case, and not to substitute the justice that the criminal case has failed to deliver to the plaintiffs so far, and the criminal case that they may never get. This case, from my perspective and from our position, is about these two people sitting right over here, Rose and Tony Pagerchis. Plaintiffs want to place blame. It's natural to want to place blame, but where does the blame belong? When a hurricane comes, are we blaming God? Mental illness is a unseen, unknown tidal wave that can come and destroy not only the individual's life who is afflicted with a mental illness, but everyone around him. And that's what's happened in this case. So who are we going to blame? Well, let's look at the facts. We know that we had the unknown, unseen, and unshared mental illness of Dimitri. We had the unknown, unseen, and unshared failures of the school. And we had the unknown, unseen, and unshared actions of Lucky Gunner, who illegally sold ammunition to Dimitri. Now, I'll say this many times because I think it's important. Feelings are not facts. For 6 years, my clients have remained mostly silent. They've lived in fear. They don't like to go out because they're the parents of the monster, right? That's who they are. And you heard in their closing that they put up these great kids, and I don't doubt these kids were great. Everything I've seen about these kids makes me believe they were wonderful, amazing human beings. But their son got a mental illness. Their son is robbed of who he was. He is no longer the son that they raised. You don't have any control to tell mental illness to behave a certain way. This is what my clients have been dealing with for 6 years. Now, this case is really about what happened before May 18th, 2018. We're not really looking so much at what happened after that date when you're looking at the responsibility and blame for my clients, right? And in the search for whether or not they should be held responsible for anything, we've gotten into every area of their lives. We've gotten super far afield of what the facts are that we should be looking at, right? We've argued about whether or not Tony got mad watching the World Cup, whether the World Cup would even make you mad enough to throw a remote control, whether Rose's family carries genes for mental illness, whether or not my client should have known when their 3-year-old child had temper tantrums and drummed on his face that he was a budding psychopath. These are not the issues. The issues are what was going on in the life of this child, young adult, at the time this happened, and looking at the months and even the year before this all happened. It was not foreseeable, it was not predictable that their son would have a psychotic break, certainly not predictable that their son would become a school shooter. Now, as to all of the defendants, Mr. McGuire showed you the jury charge, and you're here to determine whether or not they were negligent. And what is negligence? How do we know it when we see it? Well, you've got some instructions on the charge, and we know that we all have a duty, right, to act within reason, to make sure that we use ordinary care so that we don't hurt each other. That's kind of what we already know. Ordinary care is defined as the degree of care that a person of ordinary prudence would use under the same or similar circumstances. You'll be determining if all the parties, or if any of the parties, or if none of the parties fall below this standard. So the relevant inquiry in your mind should be, did Rose and Tony use ordinary care regarding the safe storage of their weapons based on the facts and circumstances that they knew prior to May 18th, 2018? Now, you have to have a duty, and you breach the duty, meaning you break that duty, right? So who failed in their duty? Well, right off the bat, right, you look straight to Dimitri. I think it's fairly uncontroverted that Dimitri developed a plan to be involved in a school shooting. It's uncontroverted that Dimitri acted in a furtive manner to make sure his plan wasn't discovered. Dimitri stole guns from his family home, finding a way to bypass the reasonable and prudent efforts that Rose and Tony had taken to safely store their weapons. And then Dimitri ordered ammunition online in furtherance of his crime. It's uncontroverted that Dimitri pulled the trigger. The parents didn't pull the trigger. The parents didn't give him a gun. The parents didn't give him permission. He never asked to look at or inspect or take a weapon. Parents certainly didn't consent to any of this. These are actions that Dimitri took. Now, there's some extra considerations you'll have to take, whether or not you believe Dimitri's mental health issues should mitigate his actions in some way, but that's for his attorney to argue, for Mr. Torres. But I think it's pretty clear that when you're looking at numbers of responsibility, that Dimitri has a large amount of responsibility in this matter. Now, I'm going to ask Ms. Goldsberry to put up the jury charge on the screen, and Mr. McGuire put this up for you earlier, and of course he thinks you should answer yes to every question. I don't think you should. I think you should definitely answer yes to Lucky Gunner, and let's talk about why. You should say no to Rose and Tony. You should say yes to Lucky Gunner. Lucky Gunner had a duty. Your question is, did they fall below the standards of ordinary care? That's a quick answer. They absolutely did, because Lucky Gunner violated state and federal law. There's a law in place that says you can't sell ammunition to an individual who's under the age of 18. They did that. Plaintiffs put on no evidence that any ammunition from the Packard-Cheese family household was used in the shooting.
I'd like to object. That's not part of the court's charge. It's improper argument.
I don't know that I mentioned the charge.
You've been provided the court's charge, and you'll even have a copy that can refer to during your deliberations, so you are to follow those instructions as given to you by the court. You may continue to say.
Thank you, Judge. And I expect I'm going to get interrupted multiple times, even though you noticed I did not do so with them. Because the reality is that they're trying to make a case from nothing. They're trying to take a bunch of little things that no ordinary person would see as problematic and turn it into something that it's not. Now, Lucky Gunner clearly broke the law, but what did Mr. McGuire tell you? Did he say 100%, 50%? He said 10%, even though he knows that they broke the law. Ask yourselves why. Why would he only assign them 10%? Now, it should be a pretty quick and clear determination for you to be able to figure out that Lucky Gunner should be held responsible. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my clients and their interactions with the school. And you are not going to see a line anywhere in your jury charge holding the school responsible. They're not a party in this lawsuit. However, you heard lots of arguing during the course of this trial about evidence. A lot of evidence we got late, a lot of evidence we didn't have context for, and you guys heard part of that, and it was probably confusing for you. But some of the records we got late were the school records, right? And in these school records, we found that the school had not notified Dimitri's parents that he had missed 57 days of school. Now, that's assuming that that record's right. I don't have any reason to think it would be wrong. But I'm going to ask Ms. Goldsberry to place that record up on the screen for us. And if she can blow that up for you a little bit, as we discussed the first time I put it up there is only a handful of times where the school says that they notified the parents that their son was absent. If he was indeed absent 57 days, that would have been a red flag and his parents would have done something. And you heard Rose testify. She was on Skyward. That's how she knew her son was failing. And you saw our exhibits here, right? We have two big exhibits. You're welcome to look at them when you're back in the jury room. filled with emails from Rose, initiated by Rose, because when she saw failing grades or she saw a problem, she would initiate contact with the school to try to solve it. This is probably why Dimitri, even though he was struggling from the 9th grade, had never failed a class, because mom would say, okay, what do we need to do to fix this? What's missing? What's the solution? And mom would find a way to fix that problem. And that's all there was to that. But if there was really 57 absences, how did he even pass the first semester? How come there wasn't a truancy letter? How come he wasn't arrested for truancy? We don't know the answers to any of those, but we do know that the parents weren't notified because they told you that. And we do know the parents weren't notified because the records say they weren't. This is another huge failure of the school. Now, you heard from multiple plaintiffs and from some of the witnesses as well, including Officer Barnes, who was one of the heroes of the day of May 18th, say that Dimitri had been wearing this trench coat to school, and it was pretty well known. You heard from multiple people. This was a known phenomenon, yet the school did nothing about it. They didn't even pick up the phone and say, hey, Mom, son is violating dress code. They didn't stop him and say, Dimitri, stop wearing that coat. They did nothing about that. And you heard Mr. McGuire very articulately and passionately tell you that we know that school shooters wear trench coats. We know that happens. So the parents should have done something. But the parents didn't see it, because you heard from Dimitri, even though I don't think you should believe what Dimitri says. And it's interesting, plaintiffs want you to believe it when it benefits them, but they don't want you to believe him when it doesn't benefit them. I'll get to that. Nevertheless, we know the parents weren't seeing this. So Dimitri was either keeping this trench coat in his car, in his backpack, or maybe at the trailer where it wasn't seen by the parents. But the school took no action on this. Maybe if they had, this day wouldn't have happened, or at least he wouldn't have been able to sneak into the school unseen with weapons. That was all part of his plan. Now, plaintiffs have argued earlier in the case that Dimitri's mom bought him the trench coat. It's 100% true. He was involved in a video project for school called The Greatest Gatsby, and he wore that trench coat in there. This was around Christmas time. He wore the trench coat in the video along with a blonde wig. He was dressed as the Daisy character, for those of you that are familiar with the book. And after that, no one ever saw him at the family wear that duster again, because let's be honest, this is Texas. It's really hot. This jacket's hot for me. I can't imagine wearing a trench coat. So he wasn't wearing it except for effect. And that effect was at school, because as Mr. McGuire showed you, he fancied himself a school shooter. He admired school shooters. He wanted to be a school shooter. Now, whether or not this was a product of his mental illness, you'll have to decide. And again, that's for his attorney to argue. But those facts are pretty clear from his writings. Mr. McGuire showed you entry over entry where he talks about these things. So whether this was a product of his mental illness or not, this was clearly on his mind, and this is clearly what he had planned. Now, we have seen from Rose's parenting style, from these two large exhibits that I have in evidence up here with the emails from the mom, that she is very proactive. And her daughter called her a helicopter mom. I know that plaintiffs have complained about every parenting decision they've ever made since this child was 3 years old. But let's be real. Nobody searches their almost 18-year-old's room. In fact, that's a pretty gross violation of their privacy. That's not happening. Most people are not searching their 18-year-old's computers, although we did have one plaintiff that said she still searches her 20-year-old's computer. So I guess it varies from parent to parent, but in reality, when a person's becoming a young adult, they start to get a certain level of autonomy. And this is necessary, right? Because we're raising children to the point of 18. In our society, 18 is when you're ready to go off in the world on your own, ready to cut that umbilical cord completely and go be your own person. And there's steps as you get up to that, right? I mean, you're a baby, your parents carry you everywhere, you become a toddler, you walk on your own. You're in elementary school, your parents drive you to school, you get to junior high, you're allowed to walk, you get into high school, you get your own car. These are life events that occur, and as you grow up, you get more autonomy, you get more privacy as you become an adult. I think it's ridiculous to put the burden on these parents that they should have been searching this child's room. Searching a room for a young man who had never had any problems. He never had a detention in school. He didn't get in trouble for chewing gum. He'd never been suspended. He never failed a class. He'd never been violent. He'd never gotten in a fist fight. He'd never been arrested. He never got caught drinking, using drugs, smoking. What were the parents? Oh, wait, I know what it is. He played video games. He's in his room alone playing video games. Red flag, red flag. As a mother of 7 children, I'm telling you, they play video games. And as they get older, they like to spend more time playing video games. Now, whether or not this turned out in retrospect to be a small portion of a mental illness is easier to see in retrospect. At the time, it's not a terribly unusual behavior. No, I don't want to go out as much. I don't see how this is some big red flag. It's just not happening. Now, you did hear Mr. McGuire and some of the other plaintiffs talk about some of the documentation that Dr. Peterson spoke about. Now, you heard Dr. Peterson tell you himself, the word choices in my report were mine. So when he listened to everyone talk and he chose the word volatile, it's not because they said volatile, that's the word he chose. He also took individual events and put them into the report in such a way that it made it look like this might have been a persistent problem. And this is all part of the doctor's analysis. I'm not saying it's right or wrong way to do it, but you heard Rose and you heard Tony, to the extent you could understand the stories we were talking about, that some of these events in Dr. Peterson's report, although they did happen, were one-time events. For example, the 3-year-old temper tantrum, fear of heights issue. Rose actually had paperwork. She still has paperwork from when the kids were in preschool and Mother's Day out. And she showed him one where a teacher one time sent home a report that said, we were up on the slide today and Dimitri was afraid to go down because he was afraid of heights and he threw a tantrum. And somehow that got written in such a way that it made it look like it was a more persistent behavior. Now, to Dr. Peterson, when he's looking at all the pieces, to him it might be. But what was reported from the family is that it was a one-time event. So as the person perceiving this, as the person living this in real time, as the person who's not going back after something horrible has happened and looking at what's happening in the here and now, that doesn't look like a red flag. Now, what would look like a red flag? When the school failed to monitor their computer systems and allowed Dimitri to conduct searches of a nature that should have set off immediate alarm bells. Ms. Goldsberry, if you would put up the searches such as Columbine evidence photos, 357 revolver, and Virginia Tech shooters. These should draw some attention by school officials. Now, plaintiffs may argue that we don't know for certain that these came off of the school records, but you can look at these exhibits. If you'll put up the exhibits, we had Clayton Horn on the stand and he testified these look very much like the block warnings that he got from his school computer when searches were done that were inappropriate searches where you couldn't get around the firewall. And we have documents and evidence. You can take a look at some of these. You also heard Clayton Horn say that he had an individual login for his computer. I believe Ms. Giannis said she thinks her son did. I'm not 100% that's who said it. One of the plaintiffs did, as well as Rose. who still has the login for her son for the school computer. Now, what about Tony and Rose? Well, you've heard me say that they didn't fail in their legal duty. First of all, Dimitri was almost 18 years old. He was about 4.5 months away from being 18. At age 17, you can consent to sex. You can consent to your own psychological treatment. If you run away from home, the cops aren't going to bring you back home. And most importantly, at age 17, when you commit a crime, you're charged as an adult. And in this case, Dimitri was indeed charged with his crime as an adult. Now, unlike Dimitri and Lucky Gunner, Tony and Rose did not commit any crime. And despite a slightly dramatic moment where a plaintiff seemed to indicate that Tony and Rose might be charged with a crime in the future, that's 100% untrue, because Rose and Tony did not break any penal statute at all. In fact, Rose and Tony completely cooperated with the police after the shooting occurred. And as we discussed in voir dire, Tony and Rose had no obligation by statute to lock up their guns to keep them from Dimitri. He was old enough to bear that adult responsibility. Yet, Tony and Rose did have their guns locked up, all of them being safely stored either in the gun cabinet or the gun safe. Still, due to Dimitri's age, Rose and Tony had no obligation to hide the keys from Dimitri. But they did. They had the keys hidden in a safe place. And Mr. McGuire's 100% wrong. The keys were not in the kitchen. The keys were not kept in a common area. If you'll recall from our direct testimony, we put up the pictures. The keys were kept in the top of a cabinet that is 8 feet off the floor in the parents' private bedroom. Now, they could have left the guns on the table. They had no duty under criminal law to lock those guns up, because I guarantee you, if they had broken a criminal law, they would have been charged with it. But they didn't. And nevertheless, they were locked up, and nevertheless, the keys were hidden. But that's not enough, right? Because plaintiffs are now telling you that I guess they should have locked the keys up too. I guess they needed a separate lockbox to lock up the keys to keep them from a kid they had no duty to keep the keys from. Or maybe bury them in the backyard. I don't know. Mr. Torres pulled out a key in a dramatic moment for all of us, I thought was really fun, to kind of indicate he had his key in his own pocket. That's fine. I mean, it's a thing. You could do that. But that doesn't mean you have an obligation to do it. And it also doesn't mean that you have a reasonable ability to foresee the criminal acts of another human being. You don't know what you don't know. And I appreciated the homage that they put up to me in their closing argument. But I really think that Socrates got it right. You can't know what's going on in somebody else's head, because if we did, we wouldn't have any homicides. We wouldn't have any suicides. We wouldn't have any crime at all, because anyone who remembers the Minority Report movie, we could recognize it before it happened and we could stop it. But as humans, that's not how we function. We're not telepathic. We don't have those abilities. We do the best we can with the observable behavior that we have. And if he had been breaking the law, if he had been violent, if he had been using drugs, if he had been abusing animals or setting fires or holding a magnifying glass on ants, anything, then maybe you'd go, we need to look at that. He had slipping grades, but he never failed. He started to want to spend a little bit more time alone. These were the two main things that you saw. And he wasn't isolated or barricaded. We showed you pictures. Let's show you some more, Miss Goldsberry. If you'll put those pictures up. These are pictures in the months, just months right before the shooting took place. This is Dimitri the summer before in Greece. Does he look like he's got some social anxiety where he's barricading himself in the room? No, he traveled to a foreign country. He's visiting with relatives and friends. He's taking younger children around on a four-wheeler. Does this look like a child that you would think, dang, he's depressed, man, look at that? No, there were no signs of depression here, none whatsoever. Let's go to some of the other pictures, Miss Goldsberry. We see him with big smiles with his family members. We see him posing for pictures. This is very close to the time of the shooting. We see a kid with a hat and a big smile. We don't see a kid barricaded in a room who looks depressed. If someone showed you a picture of this kid without any other context, would you say, that kid really needs to get some mental health intervention? Because that's the kid that Rose and Tony saw every day until he had a psychotic break. And their lives and his lives, and God love them, all of the plaintiffs, and God bless every single one of them. Their lives were forever and changed irrevocably so. Now, if it had been foreseeable to these folks that there was a simmering mental illness, they would have done something about it. You heard Tony say that his son went on a diet and intentionally lost weight, about 20 pounds. And Tony was concerned. He's like, man, you shouldn't lose that much weight. And even though Rose had already taken them to his regular doctor, Tony's like, no, I'm a little worried about this. Took him to a separate doctor to get checked because he was worried about that. That was over some weight loss. If they had seen any mental illness, they certainly would have acted on it. Looking back now, can we say it was mental illness? I don't think you can based on the signs that they saw. But when the break happened, when the psychotic break happened, all hell broke loose, literally and figuratively. And you heard Dr. Self tell us about the signs and symptoms of schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia, and how it slowly builds over time, and those behaviors, those signs, those symptoms look like normal adolescence, normal childhood, normal teenage angst. There is not necessarily anything that would alert a reasonable and prudent parent to think their child was mentally ill. She said until they have that first break. And when they have that first break, then you're able to see what happens. And heaven knows it is the most tragic thing that the first time this kid does anything really wrong is irredeemable. He can't come back from this. The plaintiff's children can't come back from this. The people who are injured can't come back from this. Tony and Rose will never get their kid back. He can't come back from this. Now, it doesn't really matter. There's been a whole lot of to-do about whether the guns were in the wooden cabinet or the black cabinet because Dimitri said so. And as I told you over and over again, and as Dr. Peterson confirmed, just because Dimitri says it doesn't make it true. Now, plaintiffs want you to believe it when things are easily corroborated, right? Like Dimitri told the police, if you go to my room, I left guns there, I hid them, you can find them. Sure enough, police went, found the guns. But Dimitri also told police, yeah, there's alcohol and cigarettes in my room. FBI searched that room extensively. We've got picture after picture after picture of Dimitri's room, in the drawers, in the closet, on the bed, under the bed, beside the bed. There's no pictures of alcohol or cigarettes. So just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean everything he says is wrong, but important things could be wrong. For example, saying the key was on top of the wooden cabinet. You heard Rose say it wasn't. You heard Vossi say when she needed her jewelry, her mom went in the other room and got the key and come unlock the shelf. But even if it was there, even if the keys were left in the lock itself, they didn't break any laws. They didn't do anything wrong because they didn't have a duty to do that. It wouldn't have been unreasonable. But plaintiffs want to build all of these signs of mental illness to say they should have had a heightened duty, that wasn't enough. The fact that he wasn't 17, that's not enough. Because something tragic happened, that's not enough. And I don't disagree with them. Something tragic happened. Everyone in this room wishes it hadn't, but it did. But it's not because Tony and Rose failed to safely store their guns. Rose and Tony safely stored their guns. Their son or anyone else with a criminal intent could have searched the house and found those keys. You saw in some of Dimitri's writings where he was talking about different ways he wanted to try to get a gun, right? Even though he knew the parents' guns were there, and as Mr. McGuire rightfully pointed out multiple times, all he had to do was like break that glass and he could have gotten a gun. He never did that because he knew that would trigger an observation and his parents would jump into action. Just like when he got his own Amazon Prime account. He had his mother's credit card. He had that so he could get fuel to get to school, to get school lunches, whatever he needed to get. And if he ever used it, which Rose told you he did one time, he got a game on Steam for his computer. Rose immediately said, hey, that's not an authorized purchase. He purchased something from Amazon and Rose told you, she said, hey, I didn't tell you you could buy that. Now, that was a ball cap and some t-shirts. It wasn't like something that was malicious, but Rose immediately caught that because she's constantly monitoring her children. So he knew that was going to happen. So he took steps to be furtive so that he wouldn't get caught. It's really ironic because Mr. McGuire has argued, and I don't disagree with him, Dimitri does say in his confession video, I thought they would notice this. But if you look at the context of that, it is absolutely not clear that he's talking about his parents. In fact, it sounds more like he's talking about school officials. Because if he wanted his parents to see something, break that glass. If he wanted his parents to see something, break open that bottom door. If he wanted his parents to see something, use mom's credit card. If he wanted his parents to see something, drive their car drunk. None of these things happened. Instead, what he did was he was sneaky. He was sly. He did not want to get caught so that he could carry out his plan because he knew if he had gotten caught, they would have stopped it. And again, I'm going to draw your attention back to the you don't know what you don't know. And to me, it's amazing how Socrates was able to succinctly identify that problem. After something happens and we see the course of events and the chain of events, it's certainly easier to go, oh, I see that now. But in this case, that's not even clear. Because if you look back at what was actually happening at that time, it certainly wasn't any evidence that there was mental illness going on, even less evidence that their son was going to commit a crime, and absolutely zero evidence that he was going to commit a school shooting, at least from what the parents saw. Now, what the school saw is a completely different thing. They saw a kid wearing a trench coat to school that apparently had these pins of power or whatever he identified them as. You think the school would pay attention to that. You think the school would pay attention to the searches because they have IT people that do that. This isn't parents at home trying to search their kid's computer, right? I mean, you've got an almost 18-year-old young man who had a computer for right at a period of 5 months. Everything that you saw in court came off that computer, other than some paper journal pages, and it's pretty clear which is which when you look at the pictures. 90% or so, and I didn't do the math for you engineers, I'm just saying, the large proportion of what you saw came off of his computer. And he only had that computer for a period of 5 months. So we know the time period in which this was happening. And it seems from his writings, at least, that he was spiraling in his head during this time period. But he didn't share these writings with his parents. He didn't share them with anyone. And during this 5-month period, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? When you're looking at what's reasonable for these parents to do. During this 5-month period, we've got one mother on hospice. We've got another mother who is very ill. We have a brother who has died. All of this going on within this 5-month period of time. Now, during this 5 months, you did hear Rose say she had actually been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Same thing with Vossi. She had been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Now, what we do know is from Dimitri's own words is that he said a lot of the documents that we're looking at here in court, he had deleted from his computer. So the context that we're missing from the evidence we have is that even if Rose had searched this computer, would she have even seen this? Because if these are deleted files that the FBI recovered off of the hard drive, Rose wouldn't have seen that. If these are deleted files that the FBI recovered, Vossi wouldn't have seen that, but we're going to hold her responsible because she didn't see it? It doesn't make sense. That's not reasonable. That's not what a reasonable parent would do. A reasonable parent wouldn't remove their kid's hard drive when nothing had happened and go get it analyzed by an IT specialist. That's not reasonable. Now, Mr. McGuire told you in his opening statement that the shooting itself was premeditated, and certainly concede that point to him. All the evidence supports that. He made plans, he made nasty comments about what he wanted to do, he took actions in furtherance of that plan, including buying the ammunition, including stealing the guns from his parents. And as I mentioned earlier, he had talked in several other places about different ways to try to get these guns. It seems that getting the guns from the parents was his last resort, because he talks about trying to maybe get a fake ID so that he can either go to a gun show or go somewhere and buy a gun. But he says in his writings that he didn't have enough money to do that anyway, so he had to abandon that. There's also some information where maybe he asked another kid for a gun. So he had considered other ways to get guns because he knew taking guns would trigger alert with his parents, which is why he took the guns out of the black cabinet in the garage, because it wouldn't be as obvious. As you saw from the pictures in this case, the gun cabinet, even though it's off in the corner of the living room, it's there enough. You see how the guns are stacked. If one is missing, it's gonna leave a gap, and that's gonna be noticeable. He took them from the other cabinet because he didn't want to be caught. If he wanted to be caught, he would have broken it open. He would have left the cabinet open when he found the keys. He could have done any other number of things, but he didn't because he wanted to hide what he was doing. Now, you have to filter this through the evidence that Dimitri was in the throes of a psychotic break. And again, that's going to be for you to determine if that should mitigate his accountability or not. Dimitri's not my client. I leave those arguments for Mr. Torres. But remember that these efforts that he took to hide the evidence from his parents means they didn't see it, right? And I agree with Mr. McGuire on another thing. I know it's hard to believe we agree on some things. He is right. You don't always know when an Amazon package is going to be delivered, or do you? All you have to do is check the tracking, and it tells you how many stops away your package is. You've got an idea when that package is going to be delivered. And if it's not delivered before you get home, you've got a pretty good idea of when it's going to be delivered, and you can run out there and grab it before anybody sees it. And it's not reasonable to hold the parents responsible for furtive actions of their son that they wouldn't have seen. Now, there's a lot of red flags they talked about. I'm just going to kind of run through some of them. We talked about them in opening. We talked about them throughout the course of the hearing. You know, this financial red flag that he spent $1,700. You heard from the witnesses that he had money that he received for birthdays, holidays. There's extra Greek holidays, other things that he received money for. You heard Katina say that her dad always has cash. It's even possible he stole cash. And Tony even told you from time to time he would give the kids 15, 20, 30 bucks. So as far as him having money, I'm not sure what the financial red flag was there, other than the parents should have known he was spending money that they didn't know he was spending. It's hard for me to figure out. But the reality is that he did have some of his own money, and he did order stuff, and it was delivered to him. There are certainly receipts to show that that happened, including for Lucky Gunner. Now, some of the items that he ordered, they're not all nefarious. You heard Mr. McGuire say something about, don't hold me to it if I get the number wrong. He had 29 packages delivered to his house, which might be true, but some of these are T-shirts, some of them are sunglasses, some of them are items that aren't nefarious. Now, certainly bear spray is a really weird thing to order, and tactical gear is clearly something that would be concerning, especially for a kid that hadn't been using guns and to their parents' knowledge didn't like or use guns. That would certainly probably have gotten their attention. But let me point another thing out to you. that in all of those FBI pictures, other than a couple of those items, there are some of those items in the picture. There's some knives and some other items there, but a lot of the other items don't show up in the pictures. So some are there and some are not. Was he keeping him in the car? Was he keeping him at the trailer? We don't know. And the parents wouldn't know that either because they don't know what they don't know. "30 minutes, Judge? Thank you." Okay. Now, some of the other red flags here, well, let me just say one more on the financial just to let you know. It's clear that he didn't use the parents' credit cards. It's clear they didn't give him $1,700 to go buy these things. So we know that much. We also know that he went and purchased cash cards in another effort to evade detection, because if he had used those credit cards belonging to his parents, he would have gotten caught. Now, these social red flags is a bit more of an enigma for me, because here we have a kid that over the years has engaged in all kinds of extracurricular activities: soccer, baseball, football, karate, band, Greek dancing, piano lessons, all of these things. I don't see that as a big red flag. In fact, if you look at the picture here, if Ms. Goldsberry will put it up, at the Greek dancing, this was 4 days or 5 days before the shooting occurred. He is out in public, he is dancing, he's involved in this community activity, he's performing. A lot of people have performance anxiety. I mean, that's a thing, even if you're not afraid to be out in crowds, performing, standing up in front of people doing public speaking or performing causes anxiety. But here he is out there doing this, and he was dancing still in 2 troops. And this was just 4 or 5 days before the shooting occurred. A kid who's out there dancing, you don't see that kid as depressed. And you also heard Dr. Self tell you that if someone is suffering with depression, they are not actively making plans. They're not Googling how to make bombs. They're not out trying to figure out how to hide orders of materials from their parents. They're not actively engaged and involved in any kind of action, much less something that required so many steps in planning as this did, including learning and teaching himself how to modify weapons so that he could do the maximum damage to people, and learning how to make bombs so that he could harm folks. That's not what a depressed person would do. And you heard that from Dr. Self as well. Now, you saw a whole bunch of these computer surveys, and I went through a bunch of these with you earlier, and I'm just going to remind you briefly because, there goes my timer, sorry. Mr. McGuire, in direct testimony, often pulled 1 or 2 of these and said, "Look at this, he's cutting himself. The parents should have seen that." There's really a big mischaracterization of the evidence. 6 times maybe he said he was cutting himself. 33 times he says he's bottling up his emotions in response to the same answer. So you're not getting a full picture. And again, let me remind you, the person answering these surveys, the person making these writings, is delusional. Now, one Mr. McGuire pointed out yet again was the massacre, the day before the massacre. We know that mom knew he was depressed because Dimitri said so. And in that writing, Dimitri says, "The day before the massacre, my mom said to me, 'What's wrong with you? Are you depressed?' Well, Mr. McGuire said, well, that really wasn't the day before the massacre. It was like 2 days before the massacre. I don't know if he forgot, but I hope that you don't forget that I told you that that same quote in one form or another appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the context of his 776 pages. The first time it appears on page 116, then it appears again on 172, 352, 355, 346, I got that one out of order, sorry, and 735. So clearly, this is not a truthful recount of something that happened. This reads like a fictional writing, and it goes along with all of his other delusional thoughts. Now, looking at the other social media red flags that the plaintiffs point out, Dimitri did open a Facebook page a couple of weeks like 2.5, 3 weeks before the shooting occurred. And it seems to me, I don't know how it seems to you, that he was doing that to intentionally memorialize things so that after the event occurred, you could look back and see that. Because we know he was fascinated with school shooters based on his writings. And so he posted a picture of his trench coat, right? And Mr. McGuire said the parents should have seen that and the parents should have been upset about it. Really? Number one, there's no evidence, even though Mr. McGuire says this is a public page, there's no evidence that they didn't have their family, that Dimitri didn't have the family blocked. Furthermore, if the school wasn't startled by him wearing that every day at school, then why would the parents be startled by seeing a picture of it on social media? That seems unlikely to me. And to be clear, even though as a parent myself, if I saw those, it would certainly make me go, what's going on here? He didn't make any threats, overt threats or warnings or forecasts on there. Although one could say that the t-shirt itself, which there is no evidence is a custom t-shirt, by the way. Born to Kill is a phrase that comes from a popular movie, Full Metal Jacket. So we don't know that that was a custom t-shirt unless Mr. McGuire has a separate receipt. And if he does, I apologize. I figure it's an Amazon order. I didn't investigate that closely enough to be 100% on that idea. But there was nothing other than a picture of the shirt that indicated anything else was going on. And there's no evidence that the parents or any family member saw it. And the plaintiffs didn't bring in anybody else to say, this was a public page, the parents were not blocked, there were no IT specialists here. And the same with Dimitri, right? I mean, Mr. Todd, who is very learned and did a very good job cross-examining the experts, he's like, you're free to believe some of what they say, none of what they say, and that's 100% correct. But what they didn't do was bring in an expert who said, that guy is wrong, Dr. Peterson is wrong, Dr. Self is wrong. That didn't happen. Now, Rose did tell you that previously Dimitri had a social media account when he was about 15, and she did monitor it. But he closed it, and to her knowledge, he never had one until he opened it here. You also heard the nosy little sister say, I would go do checks on social media. I would go looking to see if he had a social media account, and I never found any because I wanted to see what Big Brother was up to. So there is no evidence that these were forward-facing public pages as far as the family was concerned. Now, as to the other social red flags, there were some suggestions that the fact that he only had 1 or 2 friends was a big social red flag, but some kids are that way. I've got some kids that are pack animals. When they were young, they ran around with a tribe of children. And I've got some that had only one. In fact, my son, who is my legal assistant that's been here with me, he only had one best friend all the way through high school. They were together all the time. Just different personalities. There's no idea that that would be a red flag that an individual has a mental illness. Now, there is definitely some merit to the fact that failing grades is a flag. Now, whether it's a red flag or a yellow flag or just a flag, certainly that's something that will require action. And as soon as the grades dropped, we see Rose jumping into action. She jumped up to pull that flag off the flagpole. She tried to figure out what he needed to do to fix it and how to solve that problem. Now, speaking of those emails, you saw Mr. McGuire put that email up saying that it's the email where Rose is talking about she had been gone for a while and she felt so bad and she didn't know what was, going to happen with Dimitri. And they kind of tried to paint that in the context that the email was about mental health. It wasn't. The email was about Rose finding out that her son had plagiarized a paper. And Rose took that so personally. I can't believe my son would do that. That's not who my son is. And she was very upset about that. I mean, in my opinion, overly upset about that. But that had nothing to do with mental health. There's no evidence whatsoever that any individual in any capacity, whether it be at the school, at the church, in the community, anywhere, that anyone told Rose, hey, your son is doing X. This looks problematic. You might want to go get him checked. That never happened. Now, the absences we talked about, that is definitely a failure on behalf of the school. That is very problematic, and I promise you, if a Rose had seen that, that would have been a problem. She was on Skyward. She saw the grades. You heard her testify that she did not see those absences there. We now have no way of knowing whether they were on Skyward or not. Plaintiffs would have you believe they were. She doesn't remember seeing them. I guarantee you, if she had seen them, she would have taken action. Now, again, to those physical issues about Dimitri cutting himself, there was zero evidence Dimitri was cutting himself. Mr. McGuire told you that you should know that there's a problem because of the physical signs. And there was some talk about him not showering as often. You heard Rose talk about these, right? These are isolated incidents that are taken out of context. So Rose told you as a teenage boy, his hygiene wasn't what she wanted it to be. He had school football, he was showering at school, but he wasn't always showering at home. And so sometimes she would have to remind him. But she told you when she reminded him, he would go do it. She thought he was being lazy. He wasn't wanting to do his chores. He had some lack of motivation. These are the things that the parents saw. And it's not unreasonable for them to think this is normal teenage behavior or a phase or a mood that would move on. There was no indication of any depression or deep, serious mental illness or any mental illness at all. And these children, both of her children growing up, they were getting regular doctor's visits. They were going to see a doctor who evaluated these kids. And then Dimitri got even extra times at the doctor, other than wellness checks, other than times when he was ill, because he was in sports, multiple sports, and band, which requires additional physicals to be done. And doctors who examined him never saw any symptoms or signs that they thought were problematic and said, hey, Mom, you might want to get this looked at. Because if they had, she would have done something about it. And Dad would have done something too, even though Mom is the primary one who handled the children's education, as you heard from the testimony. Now, in plaintiff's opening statements, they talk about how Dimitri stated he doesn't feel treated like a son. But again, this is a product of Dimitri's delusional state. You've all heard the testimony from Dr. Peterson, where he explained how all of Dimitri's interpersonal relationships, meaning how he related to other people, were tinged and colored by his paranoia and fearfulness. And the most important part, not likely reality. So when you look at things he writes about relationships, for example, I think it's common sense. The things he writes about his schoolmates and feeling ostracized, it's unlikely that schoolmates were treating him that way. Definitely not to the degree he seems to feel it, right? Because that would have drawn attention by a teacher or somebody if that kind of behavior was going on. This was part of Dimitri's delusional state. Now, we talked a little bit about what Mr. McGuire talked about, these intentional signs. And if there was any intent to be intentional, it was at school. And if you re-listen to the clip Mr. McGuire played, you can see, if you agree with me, that it sounds more like he's talking about it in the context of school and not the parents. But there were a million ways for him to make his illness, his suffering, known to his parents, not the least of which are the 3 times that we heard about in the last 5 months before the shooting, where Rose pulled both of her children aside, and even her adult, her 30-plus-year-old stepdaughter, and talked to them about mental illness. When her brother committed suicide, talking to both of them about, if you ever feel this way, talk to me. And whatever happens, don't do anything to take yourself away from me. That's the perfect time to say, Mom, I'm having these awful feelings. After the school shooting in Parkland, she talked to both of her kids and talked about what a tragedy it is, and was, no doubt, and told them, don't ever let your anger or your sadness or your grief or whatever's going on, don't ever let yourself feel that way. If you ever need help, come and tell me. and she would have gotten help for them. But he never said a word. Because of his paranoia, he didn't want to talk about this. He didn't want to talk about Natasha. And Mr. McGuire might be right. Natasha may be a delusion that began from a character in a video game. We used to play is it not Frankenstein? It's Wolfenstein, right? I think, back when my children were younger. And that may indeed be a character, but that doesn't mean that he didn't develop a delusional belief about a character in a video game. A delusion's a delusion, right? It doesn't have a basis in reality. So whether it was just an original manifestation or it was a product of a video game, I think is irrelevant. The fact is that he had the delusion, and you find from his writings that he does talk about extraterrestrials and elder gods and supernatural beings, albeit he didn't talk about that as much as he did later with Dr. Peterson and others, because once the psychotic break happened and he could no longer hide it, then he could talk about it. After the CIA didn't assassinate him after the school shooting happened, he could talk about it. And apparently that's what he did with Dr. Peterson. Now, the plaintiffs also said something interesting in their opening argument. They said, we filed this case against Demetrios himself because Demetrios intentionally caused bodily harm to another. And in Texas, when you intentionally cause bodily harm to another, you're responsible for all of the harms and losses that you caused. Now, if that's true, according to their analysis, hold Demetrios 100% responsible for what happened. That is something you can do. And according to plaintiffs' opening arguments, that's a verifiable thing that is a legitimate analysis of what's happened here. I certainly think Lucky Gunner deserves some responsibility as well, but that's for you to decide. Now, the plaintiffs have seemed to want to walk a tightrope in this case. Dimitri wasn't so mentally ill that he shouldn't be held responsible in the civil case. We don't want you to find him insane. He wasn't that sick. He knew what was right from wrong, but we want to argue that he was depressed so that we can make the parents responsible. All of the evidence is to the contrary. Dimitri has not stood trial because he's mentally incompetent. Dimitri has been evaluated by Dr. Peterson and been found to be mentally incompetent. Dimitri is living in a delusional state right now. That's where he is. That's the evidence. The evidence isn't that he had some minor or major depressive disorder. That's not what he had. That's not what he has. But it makes it easier, right? Because they know they're not going to get a recovery from Dimitri because he's going to be either in a mental institution or a prison the rest of his life. That's a given. The parents are the only, and Lucky Gunner are the only other two options here to get a recovery. If this is really about justice and not about money, then you can write zeros in the amount for all of those, and you can hold whoever you want 100% responsible. But it's not just about that. If it's just about justice, we would wait for the criminal trial, and the criminal would be tried, and then we would see what the justice was. That's what justice is. This is trying to hold the parents responsible for a horrific event that affected them as well and made victims out of them also. Now, this is my last opportunity. Oh, Judge, mine shows an hour and 3 minutes. I have an hour and 20 minutes, right? Okay, I show 1:03, so I should still have about 17 minutes? Okay. I just want to make sure before I get too far afield here. Okay, so I lost my train of thought there with the time warning, so I apologize. The reality is that Dimitri committed this crime. He took these guns. And we know that insanity and intelligence are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to be both at the same time. And I know the plaintiffs don't want to believe that there weren't red flags. And I'm going to share with you a little bit why I feel so much for these defendants. First of all, I want to tell you that this is the last moment that I have to talk with you.
Well, any personal comments are
No,
improper or
no, they're not.
This is closing argument. What the attorneys say is not evidence, and you'll be determined in this case based upon the evidence and testimony that's been entered during this case.
Thank you, Judge. And you'll see the reason why that just happened. First of all, it's the last chance I'm going to have to talk to you. And they're going to get up and remember things that I forgot to say. They're going to go back and find something that I don't have an opportunity to respond to. So I'm going to ask you to remember, try to think what I would say if I had an opportunity to address that. Because most of the big issues we addressed in trial. But the reason I wanted to share with you a personal experience and why I have so much compassion for Rose and Tony is because it could be me. That could be me sitting right there. My son died 5 months ago. He had schizophrenia. He was more of an introvert than an extrovert. He liked to play video games.
We're gonna have to object to this.
Your Honor, you can share personal stories in closing.
Not that.
I can share the case if you'd like to know it.
Approved.
go and buy ammunition for them, which is what Lucky Gunner gave him, when he shouldn't have. So I'm asking that you find Rose and Tony zero responsible, legally responsible for what happened. Now, emotionally, they feel terrible, and they're going to be scarred for the rest of their life because this is what their son did, and they wish they had seen it. They really do. But they can't go back and change that. None of us can. But look at what they knew and when they knew it, and were their actions reasonable? And I think common sense tells you it is. You remember during the trial, I made a comment about there was no statute that required them to act differently. And Mr. McGuire jumped up and said, what about the law of common sense? Okay, well, the law of common sense is great, but they did more than common sense would say. They locked him up. Common sense would say you just put him out of reach. They locked him up. The fact that their son searched the house to find the keys to steal the guns is not foreseeable. So that is our request, that you put zero on both of theirs. Divide the responsibility equally between Dimitri and Lucky Gunner if you want. If you think Dimitri's mental illness mitigates it, put 100% on Lucky Gunner, because if he didn't have those bullets, the shooting wouldn't have happened. There's no evidence that any of the bullets came from the parents' house. I thank you again for your time and your attention. I know it's been a long 3 weeks. I appreciate you more than you know. My clients appreciate you more than you know. And I know you've got a hard job ahead of you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Closing arguments at that time.
All rise for the jury.